days. So a nice 24-hour trip. And they stayed in Nairobi the first night. And then yesterday they went and visited some of the slums of Nairobi, the place where many of the children come from, and then made their way to the Mully Children's Place out about an hour or more away. And they are there now and interacting with the people and the families there now. So I talked to Elizabeth. For her, late last night. For me, about 3 p.m. They had a 7-hour difference. So we are continuing our work with the love languages. This week, it's acts of service, and this all comes from 1 John. And as you think about 1 John, it takes us to our, I guess you have a clicker for me, or are you clicking?
It's right behind you.
Gotcha. Thank you. It takes us to our theme as a church is leading with love. We gave out keychains. If you didn't get one, I'll be glad to get you one. We gave out keychains for people that were here on Easter Day, but we still have plenty more. And we want to be a church that leads with love. And we met as a group, some 25 people, to think and discern who we wanted to be and to create a vision. And Brian Jordan pushed us with these words. He said it needs to be aspirational. It's what we want to be. We may not be this yet, but it's what we hope to be and hope to become. And so we want to be a church. That's obvious part, right? To be a church that leads with the love of Christ. That is the way that we encounter the world, that's the way we encounter people, and welcomes all. That was the part that I thought there would be more pushback against. But I think everyone agrees that people need to be welcomed in the life of the church. And someone said to me yesterday, if the church isn't the most welcoming place in the world, then what are we doing? And so to be a church that leads with the love of Christ and welcomes all, to strengthen ourselves. And that was important because of the mental health work that we're doing. And I think we were, coming out of COVID, still sort of in it when we were doing this work. And there was this sense that the work of the church is to strengthen our people to go back out into the world and to deal with what happens every day, to strengthen ourselves, our neighbors. That is our physical neighbors, but it's also the words of Jesus, how he speaks about who is our neighbor and who are our neighbors, and finally our neighbors and our neighborhoods. And that's more the universal neighborhood than it is just, Redfield or something like that. It's more as I said to someone, like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. It's the larger neighborhood in the world. And from that, we created some core values. And these core values were not something new. These were things that we identified in the life of the church. And the first thing that we saw in this church was that people were seeking Christ. That's why you're here this morning. People were seeking Christ in a variety of ways, in worship, in small groups, in study, in prayer. And we were showing love by showing up. And that was personified as we talked about it. They're not here this morning, so I can talk about them. Andy Drexler and Paul Roseman were our examples for that one. Two people who show love by showing up relentlessly over and over and over again. Serving was important, so we serve in big and small ways, and sharing more. And I think that's probably the one that is hardest in this community as we look at kind of those expanded, maybe. Whoops, sorry. That we're seeking Christ by seeing Christ in others and being Christ to others. We show love by showing up here and, for each other and for God. We serve big by serving in big and small ways, and we share more by needing and wanting less. And I think that's the one that some of us struggle with the most, is sharing more of what we've received by needing and wanting less for ourselves. And so we've been looking at the 5 love languages over the last several weeks. And the first one we did this past Sunday. Mark preached on words of affirmation. And when I think of words of affirmation, that ties into our membership vows that we say will support the church and what God is doing here with our prayers. And I find that prayers are words of affirmation. The next is quality time, and I preached about that 2 weeks ago. Quality time is our presence with each other, showing up fully for others, giving people our full attention. The next one is gifts, and that will come up on May the 5th as we celebrate our seniors. We have Senior Sunday on May the 5th, and we'll talk about gifts, the gifts that they are giving their parents as they leave home, and the gift that their parents are giving them. Acts of service is what I'll be talking about this week, and it's something that this church does very well, our acts of service. And then finally, the last one is physical touch. And that is I like to think of that as our incarnational presence in the world, is the way that we touch the world by how we live, by what we do. And it's the way we're physically present with others. So for me, the 5 love languages tie directly into the promises we make when we join the church. And I'm going to ask you later to think about which one is your love language. I know that my wife's love language are acts of service. And I'll probably talk about that on Sunday, but for her, that they're acts of service that she doesn't have to tell me to do. If I anticipate and I can do them without being told, then that's helpful. But if she has to tell me, that doesn't count. Anybody else know what I'm talking about? If she tells me, then it doesn't count. Then I'm more than glad to do it if she tells me. I tell her all the time, and I tell other folks that men are stupid, and that if you'll tell us what to do, we'll get it done. But I can't always anticipate what you want me to do. And I failed at that more than once. So acts of service and words of affirmation. She wants my focused attention. She wants my phone face down or not even with us. And so quality time and my focused attention is the way that she knows and that she feels loved. So I'm going to ask you to think about the way that you feel loved and the way that you show love to people in your family. The background of First John, you heard a little bit about this already from Garrett, from David. It's more of a sermon than a letter. It's anonymous, and the other 2 letters, or the other 2 pieces, I just think of them as letters, but 2nd and 3rd John are written by the elder, and it's the disciple whom Jesus loved. It's likely near Ephesus, and he was speaking to Jewish followers who had decided to follow Jesus, but there were a group of people that broke off and no longer acknowledged Jesus as the Son of God. There were people who denied Jesus, and he wrote the 2nd letter to a house church, to a group of people that had sort of broken away. And the 3rd, to affirm the people, to help them to stay faithful, and a 3rd to a member of the church. So it gets more and more specific. First John is kind of written to everyone, and then 2nd John is written to a house church, and 3rd John is written to a member of the church. And there have been tension and conflict in those churches. Can you imagine tension and conflict in a church? So there were tension and conflict in those churches, and these letters, or these sermons, were given as a form of damage control to try and bring things back together. And the opening, as you may recall, sounds a lot like the beginning of the Gospel of John. And we're dealing today with sort of the 2nd main section of the sermon. And it begins by saying, this message from the apostles that God is love, his children therefore should love each other and avoid hate. They are not to become like Cain, from whose hatred led to the murder of his brother. Sorry. Okay, for Christians, love is defined by Jesus giving up his life as a sacrifice for the well-being of others. When God's children trust in love for them that was shown through Jesus, it changes their hearts and minds. And so I'm going to look at it here in the New Revised Standard, and then we'll look at it in the Message. I always like to have a dialogue between those two. I think the Message is easier to understand, but the New RSV kind of may be the language that we're familiar with. We know love by this, friends, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and our sisters. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and truth. And by this we will know. By this we will know that we are from the truth, and will reassure our hearts before him whenever our hearts condemn us, for God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. Beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have boldness before God, and we receive from him whatever we ask, because we obey his commandments and do what pleases him. And then finally, and this is the commandment, that we should believe in the name of his son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he has commanded us. Takes us back to Maundy Thursday, right? Mandated love, where Jesus gives them a new commandment, that they should love one another. And all who obey his commandments abide in him, and he abides in them. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit that he has given us. And the theme verse for this whole month has been the 4th chapter of 1 John. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth God knoweth not God, for God is love. Beloved, let us love one another. I go back to the King James because that's how I memorized it. And so I have to go back to the King James. That's the way that it's in my head. And I try to say it, in the newer version, and I just can't do it. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that he that loves not knows not God, for God is love. I was able to do it that time. But the message puts it, I think, in easily understandable terms. And the message says it this way: this is how we've come to understand and experience love. Christ sacrificed his life for us. Love means sacrifice. And this is why we ought to live sacrificially for our fellow believers, not just be out for ourselves. If you see some brother or sister in need and have the means to do something about it, but turn a cold shoulder and do nothing, what happens to God's love? It disappears, and you made it disappear. I think that's pretty well said. I think that's hard to avoid those words. I love how it, focuses on living sacrificially for our fellow believers. And if you see a brother and sister in need, this is really about building up the Christian community. It's not just about any particular need on the street. He was calling them to say, hey, you've got to pay attention to your Christian brothers and sisters, and to live sacrificially for them. And if you can't live sacrificially for one another, how can you live sacrificially for people beyond our fellowship? And so God's love, if you share it, it will be there. If you see the need of a brother or sister, God's love will appear. But if you don't, God's love disappears. See what I did there? And God loves reappears by our sacrifice, by our willingness to sacrifice. And you remember there are a lot of Old Testament and God's opinion in the Old Testament on sacrifice. They're starting to question sacrifice at this point in the Psalms and Hosea and other places. Not for your sacrifices do I rebuke you. Your burnt offerings are continually before us. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. So the Hebrew people had been offering animals to be sacrificed. And even here in Hosea, you get a hint that what God is looking for is not that physical sacrifice, but is asking for a change of heart and is asking for love. But I can't think about sacrifice without going to baseball. When I think about sacrifice, I think about baseball. And Mario Cuomo, of all people, talked about it this way. He said, I love the bunt play. I love the idea of the bunt. I love the idea of the sacrifice. Even the word is good, giving yourself up for the good of the whole. And if you sacrifice in baseball, how does that count on your stats? It disappears, right? It doesn't count against you. Doesn't count as an at bat. You might get the RBI, but it doesn't count as an at bat, because sacrifice is a good thing, giving yourself up for the good of others. I know this is a sore spot for me, but the Pirates would have beat the Braves if Barry Bonds had been willing to sacrifice bunt. We had the game won. We could have beaten y'all, but Barry Bonds decides to swing away and not sacrifice the runner to third. And thus we had to hear the name Sid, Sid, Sid over and over again. And then one of my staff had the audacity to write a devotional about that for Easter. And I thought that was totally unfair. We had to call her employment into question over that. But sacrifice comes from the Old English, and it's from the Latin sacrificium, related to sacer or holy. And to sacrifice means to set something apart for holiness, to set something apart to be made holy, and to be willing to sacrifice ourselves for the good of the whole. George Carlin put it this way. Any George Carlin fans out there? He says, and finally, the objective of the two games, baseball versus football. He says, baseball is different than any other sport. Very different. For instance, in most sports, you score points or goals. In baseball, you score runs. In most sports, the ball or object is put in play by the offensive team. In baseball, the defensive team puts the ball in play, and only the defense is allowed to touch the ball. In fact, in baseball, if the offensive player touches the ball intentionally, he's out, sometimes unintentionally or not. Also, in football, basketball, soccer, volleyball, and all sports played with a bat, you score with the ball, and in baseball, the ball prevents you from scoring. In most sports, the team is only run by a coach. In the baseball team, it's run by a manager, and only in baseball does a manager or coach wear the same clothing as the players do. If you've ever seen John Madden in the Oakland Raiders uniform, you'd know the reason for this custom. Baseball and football are two of the most popular spectator sports in the country, and as such, it seems they ought to be able to tell us something about ourselves and our values. He says he enjoys comparing baseball and football. Baseball is a 19th century pastoral game. Football is a 20th century technological struggle. Baseball is played in a diamond, in a park, the baseball park. Football is played on a gridiron in a stadium, sometimes called Soldier Field or War Memorial Stadium. Baseball begins in the spring, the beginning of new life. Football starts when everything is dying. In football, you wear a helmet. In baseball, you just wear a cap. Football is concerned with downs. What down is it? Baseball is concerned with ups. Who is up? In football, you receive a penalty. In baseball, you make an error. In football, the specialist comes in to kick. In baseball, the specialist comes in to relieve somebody. Football has hitting, clipping, spearing, piling on, personal fouls, late hitting, and unnecessary roughness. And baseball has the sacrifice. Football is played in any kind of weather, snow, sleet, hail, fog. In baseball, if it rains, we just don't go out to play. Baseball has the seventh inning stretch. Give me a seventh inning stretch there this morning. Y'all need this morning. And football has a 2-minute warning. Baseball has no time limit. At least they used to not have it. We don't know when it's going to end. It might even have extra innings. How do y'all like that rule with the guy on second base and extras? No, I think that's just weird. Football is rigidly timed, and even if we've got to go to sudden death. In baseball, during the game, in the stands, there's a kind of picnic feeling. Emotions run high, but there's not too much unpleasantness. In football, during the game in the stands, you can be sure that at least 27 times you're capable of taking the life of a fellow human being. And finally, the objective of the two games are quite different. In football, the object for the quarterback, also known as the field general, is to be on target with his aerial assault, riddling the defense by hitting his receivers with deadly accuracy in spite of the blitz. And then finally, in baseball, the object is to go home and to be safe. And he says, I hope I'll be safe at home. And isn't that the whole idea? Is to get all of us safely home. That is our prayer for our children when they're out. It's our prayer for this mission team that is gone. It's to get everyone safely home. And to get everyone safely home, sometimes we need to be willing to sacrifice. The question often is, though, what are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to give up to reach the next person, to help the next person along? What are we willing to sacrifice? The First John goes on, and this is in the Message. When we practice real love, my dear children, let's just not talk about love. Let's practice real love. That's the only way we'll know we're truly living in God's reality. It's the only way to shut down debilitating self-criticism. That's not biblical language that you usually hear, right? Debilitating self-criticism, even when there's something to it. For God is greater than our worried hearts. I love that. For God is greater than our worried hearts. Whatever worries you might have, whatever struggles you might have, God is greater than our worried hearts and knows more about us than we do ourselves. That's a big word there, debilitating self-criticism. And I did some research on debilitating self-criticism, and U.S. News and World Report had a very interesting take on that. Self-criticism is the tendency to set unrealistic high standards and adopt a punitive, derogatory stance toward the self when these are not met. A researcher in Israel talks about this in his book, Erosion, the Psychotherapy of Self-Criticism. And he talks about all the negative things that can happen. He says, self-criticism is a trait that's been shown to lead to depression, anxiety, eating disorders, bipolar disorders. One of the people walked into my office yesterday and was saying, we have so many children in therapy and so many children who are needing extra help these days. And he said, is it always been like this and we just didn't know it? Or has it just been exacerbated in recent days? And our kids are going through this at a level that we never did. And I said, yeah, I do think it's different today. I think the cares that I had as a child are nowhere near the cares that my children seem to have at their age. I just needed to know what time supper was and what story I was going to tell when I got home past the time I was supposed to be there. That's about the biggest worry I remember. But our kids are stressed, they're anxious, they have eating disorders. There's so many things, and it can lead to so many psychosomatic symptoms, mental struggles that manifest in physical problems, chronic fatigue and pain. And under the weight of mounting mental health burdens, some people take their lives from debilitating self-criticism. The seeds of self-criticism are planted early, according to this author. And he says this, what is interesting is, in my opinion, is once that self-criticism has developed in people, it spreads around like an infectious disease. Self-critical children make self-critical parents and are even more self-critical, and they create criticism-based relationships. You ever been in a criticism-based relationship? I told a Sunday school class a couple of weeks ago that, and I may have said it in here, that your adult children, when you give them unsolicited advice, they hear it as criticism. When you give your adult children unsolicited advice, they hear it as criticism. Self-critical children make their parents even more self-critical toward them, and the process unfolds over the lifespan, resulting in a strong self-critical identity. And what the author says here, not just the author from U.S. News and World Report, the author of First John said, trusting in God and living out God's love is a way to shut down debilitating self-criticism, even when there's something to it. I think that's interesting that the author says, even if there's something to your critique, because I do think we have to look at ourselves. We have to examine ourselves. That's what criticism literally means. It's to study. And we do need to study ourselves and our actions, and perhaps hear that critique of ourselves, but not let that be debilitating. What the author of First John says is the antidote to self-criticism is self-compassion and God's compassion. If you'll trust in God's compassion, the writer of U.S. News and World Report says self-compassion, but the author of First John says, if we can trust in God's compassion, God's love for us, to see ourselves with God's eyes and to love as God loves, then we could be less critical of others and less critical of ourselves. And too many people let that self-criticism stop them from trying anything. So this is my word for the day. God is greater than our worried hearts. So give your worries to him. Don't hold on to them. Give your worries to him. And finally, the author of First John finishes like this. And friends, once that's taken care of, we're no longer accusing or condemning ourselves. We're bold and free before God. Sometimes people who spend so much time criticizing and condemning and accusing others have that script going on in their own head. And what the writer of First John is trying to say is, stop it. Let that go. And stop condemning yourself and letting that bubble over into the way that you treat others. He says we're able to stretch out our hands and receive what we ask for because we're doing what God said, doing what pleases him. Again, this is God's command, to believe in his personally named Son, Jesus Christ. He told us to love each other. In line with the original command, as we keep his commands, we live deeply and surely in him, and he lives in us. And this is how we experience his deep and abiding presence by the Spirit that he gave us. He told us how to love one another. And that takes me to my next topic, General Conference. I leave a week from yesterday. General Conference will start 9:30 next Tuesday morning. So I won't be with you. There are 864 of us from around the world. We're worried that of those 864, many of them will not be able to get there because of transportation and visa issues. There are 66 delegates from the North Katanga Annual Conference. How many of y'all know where North Katanga is? Your bishop came, okay. And where is North Katanga? It's right there. Kenya. Yeah, it's to the left of Kenya. It's in the north part of the Congo. Yes. So the Republic of the Congo. It's the largest United Methodist Conference, and they also have Tanzania. And it's interesting. Tanzania is easy to get in and out of. Getting in and out of the Congo is much more difficult. He has 66 delegates. He has 50 that have visas, and he thinks that 60 of the 66 will get to travel. Here in North Georgia, we have 22 representatives, and only 21 are able to attend. So we're down a delegate here, and it'll be interesting to see how many people are actually able to get to Charlotte. When you say political, Bob, it may be political because it may be that somebody came here for General Conference in 2016 and brought their son with them, and their son stayed. And so when you go to the office to ask if you can get your visa, they'll say, "Don't you have a son?" And he'll say, "Well, yes, I have a son. Didn't we give your son a visa and he didn't come back? You know, this son is here. He's got a job. He's basically supporting the whole family back in the Congo." But they have to say, "Yes, our son didn't come back." And so they say, "You can't have a visa." So there are things that happen like that. There is a lot of paperwork. There's been a lot of unrest in the Congo. So we as the US are probably a little bit more stringent on the Congo than on Tanzania and then some other places. So it does depend on your country of origin, how difficult it is to get a visa. And it also depends on things that may have happened in your own family. But he was pretty confident that he'd have 60 of his 66 people to be able to do that. But even going and getting the interview for your visa is difficult. Many of the people of his 66 have never been out of the Congo before. He's a pretty powerful guy. He is. He's amazing. Yeah. Bishop Miambo, he was here this past. Oh, sure. Yeah, he's well connected. And he was here this past week, and he talked to our delegation about what we were going to be facing and what his hopes are. for this conference. So this week, I would ask for your prayers, friends. I would ask for you to pray for all of us who are there, and to pray that we will discern where God would like us to go and hope us to go, and that we can figure out how to go there together. We've had so much strife and consternation, and I just ask that you pray for the decision making. The three things that are before the general conference, these are the big things. I've got 3 books of legislation about this thick that we will review. And the first week, we'll review all the legislation in what are called legislative committees. There are 14 legislative committees, and we'll review all the legislation there. And then if it gets approved by that group, a majority of the people in a subcommittee, I'm on a subcommittee that only has like 86 members. So I'm on financial administration, and anything that has financial implications comes to us. We approve the budget and work through the budget and recommend the budget to the general conference. And anything that has to do with finances comes to us. And if it has financial implications, then we have, somebody puts forth a piece of legislation and it doesn't cost anything, we don't have to deal with it. But if it's new and it costs money, it has to be incorporated into the budget. So we're kind of like the finance committee of the general conference. So we ask for your prayers. The 3 R's are what are at the head of everyone's mind. The first is regionalization. Right now, if you're in the U.S., you're held accountable to the whole book of discipline. But if you're in Africa or the Philippines or Europe, you can adapt the book of discipline for your own needs. And we can't do that here in the U.S. If we regionalize, some of these visa problems will not be as big a deal, because we'll be able to have a regional conference in Africa, a regional conference in the Philippines, a regional conference in Europe, and a regional conference in the U.S., and then get together for a shorter amount of time to look at things for the general church. There's a revision of the social principles. These are social principles that have guided us since like the 70s, and it's time for a revision, but there's certainly some controversy around some of those revisions. And then finally, there's asked to remove language around LGBTQ. What happened the last time we were there is language was put in to make our position even more stringent. And many people in the US felt like that moved into a level of meanness beyond just some prohibitions. It just kind of upped the ante. And so that's why many people said they weren't going to abide by what happened. And it's really difficult to be in an organization where 52% of people believe one way and 48% of people believe another way. I always say to people that I would never start a building program in the church if I had 52% of the people approve it, because you've got half your people who are not there. And that's what happened with a lot of the votes. They were 52-48, 52-48. And, it depends on who was sitting in the room at any given moment. And there were even votes that tied exactly. There was one vote that was exactly like 420 votes for, 420 votes against. And when you're in that kind of divide, it's hard to figure out how to move forward as a church. So those are the things we're looking at, and we'll have that family meeting, as Brian said, at 3 p.m. on Cinco de Mayo. And I will present a 1-page sheet of what actually happened at General Conference and what didn't happen at General Conference. I'm glad to take questions after this, but I wanted you to turn to these questions now. The first is, what is your primary love language? Do you know? We've got a quiz you can take. You can Google it and take the quiz if you don't know. But what is the primary way that you feel loved? Is it words of affirmation? Is it physical touch? Is it quality time? Is it gifts? Is it acts of service? What makes you feel loved? Because often the way that we feel loved is the way we try to give love back to the world. And it's not always received the way because we don't understand, if we're a service person and we do these things of service for people, and that's not the way that they understand love, we don't understand the disconnect. The next is, when have you most recently seen someone in need? What did you do about it? How does love equal sacrifice in your life? And how or when has love changed your heart or mind? Discuss among yourselves.